Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment in Boston Public Library's Sargent Lecture Series. My name is Meg Weeks, and I'm the Curator of Interpretation here at BPL. For those of you who were unable to join us last night for the introductory lecture, and we apologize as we did have some issues with the Zoom link reaching all of our registrants, a recording of the talk will be made available online for you and anyone else to enjoy at your leisure. So we'll be sending that link out shortly to those of you that had registered for last evening. We'll also be posting the video online when it's ready to go. Tonight, we are once again grateful to our AV team for making this webinar possible, and we invite all of you to submit any questions that you might have in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of the screen. We'll be collecting these questions at the end and sharing as many as possible with our speakers. We are honored to be joined tonight by two special guests who will be providing reflections on the restoration of John Singer Sargent's murals at Boston Public Library, Kate Smith and Gianfranco Pocobene. In 2003 to 2004, these two were an integral part of the team from the Straus Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at Harvard that conducted a major conservation campaign on Sargent's Triumph of Religion mural cycle on the third floor of the Central Library in Copley Square. I want to turn this over to them as soon as possible, but I do want to provide a quick introduction to each of them and to express our gratitude for their integral work on this incredible mural cycle. They and their team well and truly brought these works back to life and secured their preservation so that present and future patrons can enjoy this important piece of public art that we all can call our own. Thank you both, and thanks to your teams. I'll also plug their excellent and comprehensive publication on the project, which is, of course, available here, both on my desk and for taking out at Boston Public Library. We'll be putting a link to the catalog record for this particular volume in the chat, and also directing any of you that have questions to a place to purchase it from the publisher directly. Kate and Gianfranco, as I mentioned, are the co-editors and co-authors of this incredible volume, and I highly recommend it. First, let me welcome Kate Smith, a conservator of paintings at the Straus Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at the Harvard Art Museums. Early in her career at Harvard, Kate had the privilege of becoming assistant conservator and project supervisor for the restoration of the mural cycles here at BPL. Since that project, she has worked in conservation labs at the MFA Boston, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, and for Gianfranco Pocobene's studio before returning to head the paintings lab at the Harvard Art Museums. Kate specializes in technical examination using radiography, infrared reflectography, and fluorescence imaging to investigate artists' materials and techniques. With her Harvard Art Museum conservation colleagues, she lectures for two History of Art and Architecture courses. One, the Making of Art and Artifacts, History, Material, and Technique, and two, the Science and the Practice of Art, as well as the Summer Institute for the Technical Study of Art. We also welcome Gianfranco Pocobene, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum's Chief Paintings and Research Conservator and Principal of Gianfranco Pocobene's studio, a private practice specializing in the conservation of paintings and murals. Gianfranco received his Master of Arts in Conservation from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada, and has worked as a paintings conservator in the US and Canada, including 15 years at the Straus Center for Conservation. While at Harvard, he participated in and oversaw the restoration of the mural cycles at BPL, including those by Puvis de Chavannes, Edwin Austin Abbey, both of those being on the second floor, and John Singer Sargent. In his private practice, he undertook the restoration of the John Lafarge murals in the central tower of Trinity Church, Boston, and more recently at the BPL, led a major treatment of Puvis de Chavannes' philosophy mural, an intimidating project, but an enjoyable one at the same time, because we had the opportunity to work with Gianfranco and his amazing colleagues. Among his numerous articles and publications, in addition to the Sargent publication that he co-edited and co-authored with Kate, Gianfranco co-authored the conservation essay in the Titian exhibition catalog published by the National Gallery, London. It is a privilege to have the talents, creativity, and innovation of conservators such as Kate and Gianfranco in our very own city, looking after our public cultural heritage. I'll now turn it over to them for tonight's presentation.
Hi there, everybody. Thank you again, Megan, for your great introduction, and welcome everybody for this conversation on the restoration of the John Singer Sargent murals at the BPL. We have a lot of images to show. This is going to be kind of an informal talk. We're just going to talk through our slides and give you a sense of the breadth and range of materials that Sargent used, and also the conservation issues that we had to deal with while we were working on the project. So just as a quick reminder, the BPL sits on Copley Square, and it's important to remember that in the late 19th century, Copley Square was seen kind of as a place where they were kind of emulating and recreating a Renaissance square. To the right of the image there, you see Old South Church. Across the square was Trinity Church. The original MFA was kitty corner to it. Symphony Hall is not far away. And then also MIT, the first buildings are just down the street. So it's this constellation of all the arts and sciences and religion brought into one place. And it really is an amazing thing. And then, of course, the Boston Public Library itself is just an amazing architectural structure with great works of art. It really is one of the great buildings in North America, really, not just America. Kate, next slide. We're going to go into the building. Now, murals were a very important and sought after kind of commission for artists, because they were considered to be the pinnacle of what you could do as an artist. Painting portraits and painting landscapes was considered okay, but murals, of course, have this thing about them, which is that they are part of the structure of a building. So there's this long-term sort of permanence. They're there for a great deal of time, and artists really strove to really create murals in buildings if you were going to make a name for yourself. And here's an image, of course, of the Puvis de Chavannes murals in the Grand Staircase. And he was, of course, one of the great muralists of the 19th century. And one thing about his pictures in particular is the fact that the paintings are set into the architecture. They don't jump off the wall. They're integrated, and this was an aesthetic of the time, which Sargent also follows to some degree. But you can see how they're painted with the plane of the wall in mind. Next slide, Kate. So Sargent, of course, did his murals on the third floor of the building, and here you see an image of the space after the restoration in 2003. And he also paints these murals, and they're applied in the same manner as most murals were applied in the 19th and early 20th century. And the technique that was used is called mariflage, and basically it involves painting on canvas, and then the paintings were brought to the site after the artist had completed them in his studio, and they were affixed to the walls or ceilings, whatever the case may be. And they were typically applied and glued down with this lead white paste, very permanent kind of adhesive. And in this case, Sargent, what really is extraordinary, as you'll see as we go through the images, is just the wide range of sort of mixed media experimental techniques and materials that he's using throughout the space. And we'll get into that in more detail. Kate, next slide, please. So here's a close-up of one of the great features of the building. This is on the south end, the crucifix with Adam and Eve on either side. And what Sargent does, which is very different from any other muralist really of the period, is that he really turns the space into a three-dimensional kind of thing. And you can see here how this crucifix actually straddles over an architectural element of the building. And we're talking about, he's not just staying within the framing of the architecture, but he kind of melds and spills over onto the architecture. So this idea of like really incorporating all the elements into a holistic kind of view of the space. Next slide. Here is an image, an archival image of the space after, this is probably about 1919, we think. And here you can see the space again. Originally it was skylit. And what's extraordinary about the space is that Sargent not only painted the murals, which you can see on the upper portions of the space, but he also designed everything that we see, the bookcases, the architectural elements that are in the ceiling, the paintwork up there, and in also the lighting, which you see here is lit up. So just an extraordinary feat where he's thinking about a whole space as his canvas, really. It's not just the paintings on the wall. Next image. So our work basically was a 15-month project, and you can here see one of the initial this is one of the early images of as we started the project in 2003, and it was really a workspace laboratory situation. We worked on the project for about 15 months, and typically on any day there were 4 or 5 conservators working on site. We also had conservation scientists doing a lot of technical work for us, working with us from the Straus Center, and a really incredible project in terms of how we had to create literally a laboratory, working laboratory on space. And here is a great image, of course, of some of the people that worked on the project. And you can actually see that it is like a work lab, other than the fact that we're having lunch here or whatever. Maybe it's a birthday party. I can't remember what we were celebrating. Anyways, great crew of people. I can't name everybody because it would just take up way too much time. But next image, Kate. So here, again, just to demonstrate the complexity of the project, it was done over 4 or 5 phases of moving scaffolding around to reach the various areas. And it really took a lot of logistical kind of thinking and processes to get this done. But here you see scaffolding being erected at one end of the hall. Next image. And aside from the work that we undertook, which we'll get into more detail shortly, one of the most important features of the whole project was that we convened an advisory committee, which included art historians, curators, conservation scientists, conservation professors, and our group. And they came 3 times during the course of the project to review the work, advise, comment on it. And this was a really excellent way for the library, who really didn't have any conservators on staff who could oversee our work or ask the right questions. It was a really question of just being upfront, honest, transparent, and really presenting all the issues so that everybody understand what we were up to, why we were doing things the way we were doing, and ultimately what the end results would be. Next image. I just want to go back here for a second. You saw the earlier slides showing obviously what the space looks like now, but in 1895, this is after the first installation at the north end. And you can see, what I wanted to just point out is just, you can see just how austere the space was. McKim, Mead and White created this hall. And you can just see very plain walls, just a bit of molding, the vaulted ceiling, and obviously the skylight, and the original building lights that are there on either side of the wall, 2 of which Sargent actually incorporates later on when he redesigns the space. But just to give you a sense of what the canvas was for Sargent as he began the project. Next slide. And then finally, before I turn over to Kate on this for this first section, here's an image of Sargent working in London in the studio, and you can see, he's painting away. He's basically created a space where he has arranged the murals and the vaults in a way that emulate what he's going to be dealing with in Boston when they're installed. And I just want to say one thing: there was a lot of communication going back and forth between him and the architects about measurements and spacing, and down to the 1/4 inch or even less than that, to really make sure that he was painting the images the way they would fit properly. And I believe I'm switching over to, or turning it over to Kate for the next little section.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the murals themselves and the phases in which they were installed. It was fascinating. We learned so much by digging into archival photographs and correspondence and reading everything we could. We tried to learn as much as we could about the murals and how they were put together so that we could really understand them from a material standpoint when it came time to know how to approach their treatment. And it was, as Gianfranco mentioned, it's mural painting at the top of the hierarchy of painting. Sargent really saw this as sort of the masterwork of his life. And he spent, I think, 25 years in total working on it. And it really was this very central sort of final legacy work for him. So it was amazing to learn about sort of the waves as the paintings came in and how the room evolved over the decades that he worked on it. And he began, as Gianfranco had mentioned, in the north end of the hall. And so the concept of the murals in a very broad strokes that I'll describe briefly, it's called the triumph of religion. And he tried to encompass the entire sort of Judeo-Christian sweep, including sort of the ancient religions up prior to Judaism as well. So we're looking at an image from the north vault of Astarte. And then also these are the Egyptian and Assyrian gods and their people. These are the Israelites oppressed under these leaders and their deities. So, just a tiny little topic that he decided to tackle. And so in addition to, but just below this group of people here, there was the frieze of prophets, which was, you can see Moses here in the center, who actually projected in a 3D sculptural way, much like the corresponding crucifix at the other end of the hall. Whereas the other prophets were painted on canvas and mounted to the wall. The south end, which faces the north end, mirrors it in a lot of ways. There's a corresponding frieze of angels to mirror the prophets. The Moses is accompanied by this crucifixion, and similarly a lunette and an arch vault describe the elements and iconography of the Christian tradition. And this, I should say, I'll go back just for a moment. This installation of the south wall happened in 1903. So 1895, he comes and installs his first set, continues working, comes back 8 years later and installs the second. So now there's the two narrow ends of the vault facing each other by 1903 are installed, with blank walls continuing in between them. In 1916, he comes back. He's also beginning work on the Museum of Fine Arts Rotunda murals at that time. So Sargent paints 3 mural cycles in his life. All 3 are in the Boston, greater Boston area. And the lunettes in 1916 along the 2 long walls again faced each other and mirrored back and forth Jewish and Christian themes and iconography along those lengths. 1916 this is an image of when he's working on these murals. He, in working in London, didn't have the space to reference readily. He actually had a 1/3 scale model of the space built for him by McKim, Mead and White to have in his London studio as a reference. And he would make 1/3 scale oil sketches of each mural so that he could put them in place and study them in context as he was working. There's an amazing record. This painting actually is in the Boston Public Library collection of a friend documented Sargent himself working in his model in the London studio, playing with lighting directions and intensities and looking at the way the lights would reflect into the gold and in the ceiling. And so he was really thinking, as Gianfranco pointed out, as the space as an immersive space and planning it from across the Atlantic Ocean. So here's a sense to give you of the impact. So the north wall with the first installation intact, you see these original architecture lights here. When he's done with the space all the way in 1919, the architectural moldings are in place and gilded, all the decorative features, these medallions, these that are low relief medallions are in place. All of this material, Sargent designed these light fixtures, which Gianfranco will describe in a bit more detail. And this is just another angle, but it does show you that the lower part of the east wall, there's a large blank space in the middle, and there's a really rich story to tell in that gap. In 1919, he comes back and does his final installation, what turns out to be his final installation of these 2 lower murals that represent synagogue and church. And we have sketches, many, many preparatory sketches and drawings and sketchbooks of his time that he spent thinking and planning for these murals. And there was an overall sketch that Sargent left us of his concept for this wall as a grouping. And it would have had the 3 lunettes above, the images of church and synagogue on either side of the central panel. And he left us this tantalizing suggestion of a landscape in the central panel. And I believe, Gianfranco, correct me if I'm wrong, but there was sort of correspondence or other pencil sketches to suggest that he was heading towards a composition of the sermon of Christ preaching on the Sermon on the Mount. before he was able to execute that painting, there was an event in 1924 where the synagogue mural was vandalized. It was seen as a very negative depiction of the Jewish faith, and ink was thrown at its surface. And there was a great deal, and I believe this will be a topic of one of the other lectures in the series, so I won't get into the details. But at the time, the mural was in fact vandalized, and there was a great deal of outcry about the way he had depicted synagogue in this way. And from what we understand, he became so sort of demoralized and I believe confused by this response, this reception, that he never in fact finished that final mural. So it remains a bit of an empty space for us to contemplate. One of the most fascinating parts of this cycle is the experimental, innovative use of three-dimensional materials. And Sargent, it's so fascinating because he was not a sculptor prior to this work. And when you think of the scale and the scope of the crucifix and the Moses reliefs, he just threw himself into the third dimension. And he seems to be thinking a lot about, dark candlelit old European cathedrals, churches, temples, this idea of being in a space and having the light react to more than simply a painted surface. So all the way from the beginning in 1895, he's using cut glass sort of costume jewelry to further elaborate on the goddesses and their jewels. On the opposite side from Astarte, there's these sort of plaster discs representing the sun, small wooden reliefs of hands at the end of gilded bead. All of these, this is a plaster relief of a lion. And these are all, I think you can see, sort of nailed and otherwise attached. This is sort of a twisted wire and nail attachment method that he was using. And he was just playing around with making these very shallow casts, needing to fit them against a curved wall. And these early experiments with attachment often resulted, we found, in sort of cracks and weaknesses because of trying to nail plaster into a curved surface, the brittle nature of it. There'd often be cracks and damages associated with the installation. You can see all these tiny brads holding the wooden hands onto the surface. He used a lot of these different materials gilded so that the light would bounce and gleam off of the topography of it. This is a side view, sort of a dramatic shadowed cast of this 3D sculpture. It's nearly a sculpture in the round. It just leaps off the wall, and a remarkable feat for someone who hadn't sculpted before. And I believe he consulted with Augustus and Gaudens for a lot of these works in terms of how to approach casting and the building of these things. It's just gorgeous. And not only, so this is plaster painted, and then this sort of metal that's now become like this sort of rusted metal, but even drawn on and onto it. So he's sort of treating it like a drawing surface. I mean, he's just absolutely playing and experimenting left and right. This is the second installation, the south wall. It appears that he became frustrated with the way plaster was behaving or not behaving, and the brittleness of the plaster reliefs that he was using, and they were only used in 1895. Moving on from there, he found ways to create these low reliefs and much more flexible materials. So in this case, all these paper mache is the way he articulated these sort of low relief cast paper mache that could be nailed in and have a bit of flexion. And he seems to have had a great deal more success with that and ran with that. This is also all paper mache and painted and mounted to the wall. In the Madonna of Sorrows, also on the southern, in the archway of the southern mural set, there's these electrotype metal swords that were attached to indicate the sorrows piercing her heart. And there was also a row of candles at her feet that were also in electrotyped metal. This is the only place where that kind of a relief material was used. And then moving into 1916, during the third installation phase, he discovered this material called Lincrusta Walton, which was sort of a popular interior decoration material used to an inexpensive mimicry of embossed leather for wall coverings and other things like that. So he found this material and really liked it, and liked the way that he found this corrugated version of it that he could paint on. it was gilded, and he could paint on it to still play with the reflection of light, but it was a very flat but corrugated surface, and it gave him a lot more, even more flexibility. He could cut them out and just nail them on. So all of these materials are not the purview of a painting's conservator. So Gianfranco realized early on that we were really going to need to incorporate into our team model having an objects conservator as part of the operation to really be more intimately involved with all these materials. This is Angela Chang on the right, who's actually now the assistant director of the Straus Center for Conservation. She was brought in as an objects conservator for this project, and she focused on the plaster, the paper mache, the metal, the glass, all of this full range of materials, and studied them really intimately. This is a plaster wing that we're taking off of the north wall, and you can see by the looks on our faces, it was a nervous operation because they are very, very fragile. And here's Angela conserving some of those golden hands. And looking back at the jewels on the figure of Astarte, it was really beautiful because the grime and accumulation over time. This is a jewel. She had 2 sets of jewels, and this is the effect of just removing the grime with just aqueous water-based solutions. They were really glittering again. It transformed things. So let me see, where am I? At this point, here's the finished hall, entirely installed with the lights in place. He was very interested in the directionality of the light, the natural light coming from the skylights, the electric light coming from the fixtures that he had designed below. Gianfranco, I believe this is, I think handing it back to you at this point.
Yeah,
so
swapping over. Yeah, so as Kate was saying, and I said earlier, one of the major things that he did was also to, relight the hall according to how he wanted the murals to be viewed. And it became a point of contention later on as alterations were made, and we're going to see those shortly. But again, you see here the hall after he's basically completed it and what it was supposed to look like. We can go to the next slide. And so what I want to sort of focus on for a moment now too, before we move on further on, is that in terms of our project, because with the Straus Center, we were in charge of the whole project. We didn't mention earlier, I didn't mention earlier, there was a huge construction phase going on in this part of the building, and we were just one small part of it, but we were isolated and separated from everything else. But the 2 main things that we had to address in terms of our work were issues with just how grime and soot had accumulated on the surfaces of the mural, the issues that then evolved from that, which had to do with restorations that occurred because of the grime accumulation, but also then alterations to the lighting. And this detail, actually, Kate, you can point it out, along the molding there, sort of that, yeah, this is 19, this is not late, that's not far along, but we already see a lot of dust and grime accumulating on the surfaces of the projecting architectural elements, which means by extension then also all of his reliefs. And what we forget, or we should be reminded of, is the fact that the Boston Public Library is right next to Back Bay Station. And of course, at that time, you would have had steam, coal-powered locomotives, and it was a main terminus, and this is where all the trains pulled in, and then they were blowing their stacks. And one of the great discoveries we made going to the BPL archives was all these communications about the amount of soot, like heavy soot, landing all over the place, not just in Sargent Hall, but all the other murals, and the difficulty that the library had trying to keep up with this issue. Fortunately, we don't have that issue anymore. We have other issues with pollution, but it was really bad. So that's sort of the context of the major issues we were dealing with or had to contend with. Next slide. So this is an image taken when we began our initial study in 1999, which shows the accumulation of dust and grime since the 1953 restoration, we presume. So over a course of almost 50 years. And you can see just how it's just piled up on there. So if I back up just a second, in 1999, before we actually began the project, we did we worked in the space for several months to get a handle on what the project was going to entail. what we could accomplish in terms of the conservation and restoration of the space. And we'll come back to all those details of conservation and restoration. But clearly this was one issue, and an obvious problem that had to be dealt with. Next slide. And as I had mentioned before, because of the issue of the amount of grime that was getting on there were cleanings in the 30s and the 40s. 1953 was the last restoration before we did our work. And I think you can see from the slide over the head of the angel here in the background, yeah, right there, you can actually see the texture of the canvas, the weave showing through. And there was a lot of criticism that was leveled at the 1953 restoration, accusing the restorers who did the work at that time of having over-cleaned the murals. And as you can see from that surface, it looks kind of abraded, like the weave of the canvas has been exposed. So this was another issue in the back of our mind of how much damage had been done possibly to the murals before we even did our work. Next slide. So the one thing that I want to just briefly touch on is we've been going back and forth interchangeably, Kate, about the words restoration and conservation. So, and the words that we use, conservators, restorers, we do both those things. And they're interrelated, they're slightly different things, but conservation often typically alludes to the fact that we're trying to arrest and preserve, arrest problems from occurring and preserving what's there. If there's flaking paint, we will reattach it. That's a conservation measure. Restoration falls more into the purview of if there are damages, what do we do to reintegrate those losses or damages so that they look like they're not there? And restoration took on a bit of a bad name, a bad rap over the years because of the over restoration of paintings where they were often repainted wholesale. But those are two things that we do. And really this project was a conservation and restoration project, as you'll see from the other surfaces that we worked on and how we tried to reintegrate them. And really when you're working on a work of art like this, or any work of art, the conservator, what we're trying to do is balance the history of the piece with the materials that the artist used, the passage of time, what's happened to it, how other restorers have worked on it, how the materials have degraded. And you're trying to basically contend with all those things and come up with a way of presenting that work of art as faithfully as you can to what we might imagine the artist intended. And there's a lot of nuances there, but we're always trying to shoot for that. And in this case, with this project, what we were shooting for was the state of the hall in 1919, how Sargent left it. That was our target in terms of what we were trying to accomplish. And let's go on to the next slide. And here again, now you see on the left, the north view of the hall, 1919. You see Sargent's sconces on either side that he fabricated, had them cast in bronze. They were attached. Whole new lighting system to display his murals. And then what happened was in 1953, there was this major cleaning. And one of the things that went alongside with that, because there were complaints about the grime and the dirt all over every surface of the murals, but also that people couldn't see the murals. So there was this background conversation about relighting the murals or making them more accessible to the public. It's an issue we still have today. Everybody wants to see more and more. And I think one of the issues we have is we're all used to our bright cell phones and TV screens. And this is from another age. And we're sort of seeing or trying to see these things in a way that they weren't originally meant to be seen, or weren't painted that way or fabricated that way. But the one thing that's really interesting about the image on the right, and Kate can point it out, one attempt they made to increase the lighting levels is that they basically put these kind of Art Deco-y looking kind of buckets, I guess I could call them, on either side running down the hall, lighting them up, and they turned off Sargent's lighting because people found them not working properly. So they really kind of bungled the lighting. They're trying to improve it. They just actually made it worse. And there was a whole period of time when actually during the war, the skylights had been covered over, just basically, just covered over. There was no more daylight coming in. And then in this 1953 restoration, they installed fluorescent lightings up in the skylights, which meant that you have these fluorescent lights lighting from above, and then these warm lights in these canisters on the walls, which was really bizarre. So things were really out of kilter. And this is, again, an example of what we had to contend with. Next slide. I can't remember if I'm still talking away here. Yeah, so back to 1999, we did an initial survey, a lot of examination about condition, making sure that we understood the materials as much as we could and what we could do in terms of cleaning and conserving and restoring the surfaces. Next slide. Yeah, and here we are actually taking, this is Philip Klossmeyer, who's an integral part of the project. He's actually got a scalpel in his hand. He's taking a small cross section, which Kate's going to show you examples of that later, which basically, little samples that we take and mount so that we can study the layers of paint and any grime or restorations that are on the surface. And next slide. And there I am actually doing an initial dusting of the surfaces because we just couldn't leave them looking the way they did because it was just really scary, the amount of grime and again, heavy layers of soot that were on there. And next slide. And that's you. You can get back to Kate. Yeah.
So the 1999 study established what the issues were and proposed solutions and a plan for proceeding. And then in 2003, we actually built the full scaffolding and got up to the top of the room and got to work. And this is an image of me on the left shooting before treatment photographs, which is an enormously important part of our work, is the documentation before, during, and after any treatment, any visual impact we're going to have on a work of art. We need to carefully document it with photographs and written reports to describe the rationale and the methods that we use, both for future conservators to consult and also just to leave a transparent record of our work. So we did take our own photographs. We also studied the archival photographs that had been taken when the murals were finished very, very closely. And that became a really interesting moment because, as Gianfranco had mentioned, there had been this criticism leveled against the 1953 treatment that abrasion and damage had taken place. And we accepted that at face value initially. And a big part of that argument was that photographs of the paintings taken just after they were finished did not resemble the appearance of the paintings in present day in the 50s, 60s, 70s afterwards. And we began to look at the archival images ourselves as a record of what the original condition had been, and also just as a document to refer to in our work, and began to notice these strange shifts in tone and value and contrast. For example, in the Astarte mural, these light blue colors here are very, very bright, higher contrast in this image, and almost as light as the white moon below her feet. Another example would be in the Heaven mural. The contours that are red in this image here, a dark red, were very, very dark, and the blue color of the background darker as well. And just seemed that the contrast, the relationships between the tones in the black and white images seemed to be more pronounced. And what we learned in consulting actually with photo conservator colleagues of ours was that when these images were taken in, be it 1895 or 1916, the film, the technology of the photographic film at that time had orthochromatic film was sensitive in very particular ways to colors like red and blue. Sargent used red and blue in his contours and defining in relationship back and forth. And when the photography overemphasized the darkness or the impact of red colors, or underemphasized the darkness of blue colors, it gave the appearance of damage or wear when in fact it was simply a photographic distinction that was being made, a chemical reaction in film. That was really important for us to understand as we embarked, so that we didn't misinterpret what we were seeing with our actual eyes rather than the photographic record. And that became really important in understanding what the true condition of these murals were. For example, in Israelites Oppressed in the North End, we were looking at the abraded surfaces that had been claimed as damaged, and looking more closely. And as we began to remove the three-dimensional elements to stabilize those that were having problems, I want to draw your attention to the feet of this winged deity here. And a detail, when we removed one of these gilded plaster reliefs, below the surface, you can see the canvas weave, the way it's clearly visible, that had been protected by this relief since it was made. And it has the same sort of canvas weave abraded quality as the exposed paint next to it, which had been perceived to be worn away and damaged. What we began to realize was that the surface of the paint was actually entirely intact, and that Sargent had been working in a very thin, washy, sort of rubbed way in a technique that's been referred to in other artists' work as weavism, as a way of using the texture of the canvas to give a sort of to rub the paint in like a rather than covering it. And so it was an intentional effect that Sargent had achieved, and that was very encouraging to us as we proceeded in our work. I want to show you a series of images as we began cleaning the surface. There was not only the dust and grime, the dust that Gianfranco mentioned, but also surface grime, which was attached more firmly to the surface and was really sort of embedded in the paint. But also, as you can see, in this angel from one of the lunettes, sort of dark sort of smear around their shoulder. And in the archival photograph, all of this musculature was clearly visible. And this image, I'm going to go back here, was taken, as you can see, this is the line of where we've been cleaning. So this area here had an initial pass of cleaning in place. And we didn't know if this coating here was intentional or not. It was hard to read what was going on. When we were looking at the archival photos, taking into consideration the impact of orthochromatic film, there was so much musculature available and visible here. It was fairly clear to us that that material was not part of the original structure, and we were able to clean it, remove it, and regain back that surface. So we were able to use the archival photographs as a guide when they were carefully interpreted and not taken always at face value. The cleaning required a two-part process because there was not only grime and dust, but below the surface in 1953, after the paintings had been cleaned, they were coated with a layer of wax to protect the surfaces. That wax had imbibed further grime on it and had discolored itself. The wax had a solubility that required aromatic solvents, things like mineral spirits and xylenes, whereas the grime and the dust on the surface was more responsive to water-based cleaning systems. So we sometimes used emulsions using surfactants to bring those two oil and water type elements together. And sometimes we cleaned stepwise, removing the dust, then going back with a different solvent, removing the wax, and then going back, removing residual grime, and then sort of this stepwise process. On the right is an image, a detail during cleaning. You can see the really dramatic effect that removing all that wax and grime had on the surface. It was very, very satisfying. Slow because it was multiple stages of cleaning, but very satisfying to see emerge. This is an image of me up on the scaffolding, cleaning the Assyrian king. And then here's the stages of cleaning. So before cleaning, and then we would do that first pass to get the wax off, and then come back with a water-based chelation solution to remove the grime. And you can see what we regained was the sense of volume, depth, contrast, space. The accumulation of grime had really just flattened all of the compositions. Here's Gianfranco cleaning some of the angels, and just the way they would begin to emerge. It was just gorgeous, and you just realize they'd been truly sort of just so darkened in the intervening 50 years. Here's my colleague Terry Hensick cleaning up in the arched ceiling, reaching all of these surfaces. We were often cleaning over our heads. It was a bit tricky to get access to everything. And I have a series of a few before and afters just to give you a sense of the impact. And so above is before and below is after. And so the colors remain similar, but the overall impact of, like I say, hue, saturation, and depth were really improved. This is a cleaning window that we had done early on. So the overall before treatment includes this cleaning window, but then when the entire mural was cleaned, we regained so much. One of the complications was we learned early on from a sample that we took this is the fall of Gog and Magog from the east wall. I'm going to show you the sample site. Here's a detail in this square. We took a tiny sample from this stroke of paint because we noticed that there was a sort of a matte, slightly discolored coating that had a few daubs of what looked like original paint over it. And we wanted to be very careful before proceeding and removing a discolored coating if it was going to undermine any original paint. That sample a piece of the paint, maybe the size of the head of a pin, was mounted in resin and then polished from the side so that we could look at the stratigraphy, the buildup of paint layers. And I'm going to show you that cross section at many times magnification. So this is the various layers of paint. You can see the red and blue pigment particles mixed in varying ratios to get different effects. This layer here, which has the appearance of being clear or transparent, and then a thinner layer of paint on top. So what we're looking at here is several layers of paint and then a coating, clear, but brown, darkened, and then more paint on top. And what this told us was that Sargent, whatever this material was, Sargent had applied it because his paint came afterwards on top of it. So we needed to proceed very cautiously. Further evidence of this coating could be seen. This is a detail of this area here. You can see these drips running down the surface. And so he'd applied it on site after the murals had been installed. The coating had happened. So it seemed to be in response to something about they were painted in London, but coated in Boston. So what was he doing? What was his goal? It seemed that he was addressing something about it matting down the surfaces, potentially because of the way the light was falling from the skylight, something about glare. He was trying to create a very specific effect, but the coating itself had discolored enormously, was very, very brown and really was disfiguring. So what we needed to do was find ways of identifying the coating, removing it selectively from where it was safe to do so. And we did proceed with that process, keeping in mind the goals that he had in terms of his final finish. And so when our surfaces were clean, we did need to make choices about how to leave the coating. And so in varnishing the murals at the end, we did choose a varnish, a synthetic resin that we could apply in a very low concentration to seal and protect the surfaces without making them very, very glossy, to mimic his original surface qualities as well. And this is that resin was dissolved in a solvent that's not healthy for humans to breathe, so we did wear respirators while we were applying it. And I think, Gianfranco, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yeah, so another discovery we made as we were doing, and I have to say, we didn't point out at the beginning, either of us, is that when you're working on, and it happens a lot with a lot of paintings, objects, you don't know everything, but on something this scale, you don't know a lot of things, and you make a lot of discoveries because you're finally up against the surface of a painting or an object, and you really spend time and start to observe what's going on. So another one of the interesting things that we discovered was, these are two images of the North Wall. One obviously on the top is 1895, and then again reshot in 1919. And if you look at the top, the molding above the figures, on the top you can see that there is no inscriptions that identifies the prophets, the Hebrew that we see down below. You can also see in the lower image, at the lower part of the molding, how there are those dental kind of relief beads that are put underneath there that are not in the image above. So it's interesting that in 1895, he leaves it like that. When he comes back in either 1916 or 1919, he modifies this surface. And it's not just that, but I'm going to show you he also does something to the background. But it seems to be clearly a reaction to the installation at the opposite end of the wall. He sees the two things in place. Now he's reconsidering how this was the first phase, how this needed to respond or be balanced with the other side of the hall. So you can think of the fact that he was working in 4 phases, 4 installations, but he's constantly going back even to the original installations and modifying and making adjustments, again, thinking about the whole thing as a work of art, holistic kind of vision. If we go to the next slide, we're going to zoom in, I believe, here on, so this was interesting. One of the things we started seeing with the photographs was something odd about the surface of the gilded background behind the prophets. And you can see in the lower image here, we actually pulled up this half round bead. You can see the nail on the right here that was holding it, and we've just pulled it and lifted it up slightly. And what you see is kind of a mauve gray kind of layer of paint, and then a dark line, kind of, it was a remnants of dirt and a glaze that we realized was on there originally. So if we go to the next image, we can see that there's been a change. It was paint and then it's gilded. these two images, it's a comparison of the cleaning after we cleaned it. It's not the final restoration image, but the cleaning after we cleaned that surface, and comparing it to the 1919 image. You can see how on the top image, the gold on the molding and the gold behind the profits has the same reflective quality to it, very shiny. If you look at the 1919 picture, you can see that the molding with the Hebrew inscriptions on there, again, is very reflective, but the background behind the profits has a much more subdued tone to it. It's not the same glittering kind of shiny gold. So this was an odd thing that we realized that, this is an area again where Sargent had gone back in there and actually made adjustments to the gilding. So if we go to the next image, I believe we're going to see, having understood that he'd made this change, but clearly what had happened was during one of the cleanings, this must have been a very fugitive glaze or something he put on there. And when it was cleaned, 53 or the 40s, this glazing came off along with the dirt. And you have to, and this is not a criticism again of the previous restorations, they didn't have the technology that we're fortunate to have in terms of being able to do cross sections and analysis and identifying your materials. We're in a great place. In 100 years, it'll be even better. But we were able to determine that this glazing that Sargent had put on had been accidentally removed, and it's not difficult to do with a lot of paintings. So here you see an image on the left of just of a test area and applying a glaze over the surface again to mat it down again and just differentiate it from the molding above. And again, this is a very easily reversed kind of coating that's on here. It's a varnish with a tiny bit of umber pigment in it, basically is what it is. Very straightforward. Next image. And here you can see the change from after the cleaning and then after the reglazing, how it just subdues that background behind the profits as what we believe Sargent intended in terms of his vision of that wall. Next image. So we've focused mostly on the murals, but of course, as I mentioned at the very beginning, Sargent designed everything. And in fact, these reliefs were done by a plasterer named Coletti, and they were installed in the late phases, the 1916 phase particularly. And here you see one of our many hands-on workers doing, this was a straightforward thing in terms of the gilded reliefs up in the ceiling, the vaulted ceiling. They had not been restored or overcleaned or in any sort of way. They just had a lot of grime and accumulations of dust on it. So this is a very delicate, light surface cleaning to remove dust and grime, but they were intact and in really great condition. Next slide. The one thing that we did discover was that there was the paint, the panel sort of sections outside of the relief moldings. You can see as this kind of this funky beige kind of smeared kind of paint, and we quickly realized that there was something very odd about it. And if we go to the next pair of slides, you will see on the top you see an image from 1999 that we'd taken, and you can see just this flat wall color on the surfaces of the ceiling. But if you look at a detail of a 1916 image, you can see, in fact, that those surfaces, what we had as flat wall color, were actually articulated and worked in a way that mimicked kind of a faux travertine marble kind of surface. And you can see how the border is darker than the inset panel, that triangular panel. So Sargent had this done in a way that really created a more dynamic surface to even those flat areas. It wasn't just the gilded relief areas that are really beautiful. He also thought about those flat surfaces that they need to be articulated. So the next slide actually, I think, is another detail of the image. Yes, you can actually see we'd taken some samples of the plaster, including the plaster. We wanted to get all the stratigraphy in here. And we realized that there were multiple buildups of later paints on top of the original surface. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that we actually also did an exposure. The original was painted in oil, this distressed kind of travertine faux marble kind of look. And the overpaint, unfortunately, was also an oil paint. So the problem there is, of course, it's really difficult to dissolve the oil paint on the surface of an original that's also oil paint. Your solvents will easily affect what's underneath. And in fact, those were really delicate glazes that were on there to achieve that look. So it was basically impossible to remove that overpaint without damaging the original. So this is an example of where we do actually restoration rather than conservation. And if you see, go to the next slide, Kate. What we did is we worked with decorative painters, John Canning Company, who'd been working on other parts of the building with us. And after studying it very carefully, we came up with a technique of applying 3 or 4 shades of this white and beige kind of color to create this travertine marble kind of look. And you see one of the painters applying it on with actual sponge. And this image shows the top before treatment and after treatment below, the restoration of those surfaces. And you can see how it just picked out the colors beautifully to recreate the surface that we believe Sargent intended for those areas. Next image. Okay, you can jump into here.
When you spend 15 months staring at murals, you go a little bit off the deep end. And we were just so connected to these figures and images, and just felt like we were a part of it. So we wanted to document that feeling. And there was actually a long historic tradition of communities creating these what are called tableaux vivants of these murals in particular. The Frieze of Prophets had a very active life outside of the library, and that it was reproduced in schools and post offices and public places all over the country. It was for some reason, a very, very popular consumed image, and tableau vivant had been documented being made of it, of people recreating it with real people. In the early decades of the century. So our team decided to do one of our own, and I think you can see some of us. Here is Gianfranco, and here is me drawing my sword, and various other members of the conservation team and the consulting team that joined us 3 times during the course of the project, recreating our own personal favorites. So that was a lot of fun, and we blew off a little steam, and I think did a pretty good job.
It wasn't my idea, but it was great.
It would be Angela's and my idea. We spent maybe a little too much time designing it.
Yeah. And here, this actually is our last image, and we're ready to take questions, but you can see the space after the conservation and restoration treatment. And we again worked with the architects in relighting the original sconces that as Sargent intended them. It remains a problem in terms of just how much you can see. We're just in a different culture where bright lights and everything is just what we're used to, and an issue still in terms of what you can and can't see, and a lot of people do get upset when they can't see something. They expect to be able to see every surface brightly lit, and one has to remember this is a different era and a different time, and there's a balance there somewhere. Not an easy one to draw, but I think that's all I have to say, Kate. If there's anything else, otherwise we're ready to answer questions, and I'm sure it looks like we have a bunch of questions, so we will take them.
I am happy to jump in and read a couple of the questions. We have some great questions in the Q&A. Those of you that want to ask a question to Gianfranco and or Kate, please feel free to drop that in the Q&A chat. I'll pull a couple of them the best I can in the next 5-10 minutes or so. We might sneak a little over the hour if you guys have time, and if you viewers are able to stick with us. First off, thank you, Gianfranco, and thank you, Kate, for this excellent presentation. And thank you for all the work that you've done, that you continue to do, as I mentioned, in our community to bring these cultural heritage materials back to light in some cases, literally, but also to make them part of our public cultural patrimony. I mean, you're well and truly saving these murals and making them accessible to all. So we at the library appreciate all the work that you've done and you continue to do, and you've been great friends to us in that way. Kind of tailing off of that, and Gianfranco, you and I had a conversation about this recently. A couple questions address, when do you think the next procedure should take place, and how often in the future would you expect this level of cleaning to be necessary? And I know this is timely. We've just had a discussion about this, so do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, it's an important one. Actually, we've been talking about it for years, and there needs to be a regular maintenance schedule of clearly just double checking the condition of the murals, that everything is fine, and if they're in a case with especially these murals that that you need to sort of get up there and dust them and just assess their condition to make sure everything's all right. In fact, about 5 or 6 years ago, we did do a first run at the Abbey murals on the second floor. We spent a week or two inspecting everything, examining them, and basically getting all the dust off the surfaces. But actually, we did have a meeting with the library, and we are planning actually a very a much more organized kind of schedule in terms of going through the spaces one at a time and addressing that exact question of maintenance. Again, some of the surfaces you can get through pretty easily when you're in the grand staircase. Some of them are easy, some of them are not. This is particularly problematic. You have this big staircase going down to the second floor. How do you get up there? Just the cost of scaffolding or lifts to get in, it's just, another thing to consider, but something that has to be done, but not an easy thing given the way these murals are installed and the spaces that were designed around them.
Something else.
Certainly a massive.
Sorry, Kate?
I was going to say that the removing dust and that kind of maintenance is certainly one thing that should be done fairly regularly. But our choice of restoration materials that we added to the murals once they were clean, like the varnishes that we applied to the surface and the paints that we used to a very, very small degree for any retouching, were chosen with a great deal of stability and reversibility in mind, so that hopefully something of this nature, with requiring solvents and cleaning and removal of varnishes, we would hope wouldn't be necessary for another 100 years, if but that's it. And with good maintenance, maybe that could be achieved. Our hope is always to be the last one for a long time that needs to do anything like this, but often it happens more frequently than that.
Yeah.
Thank you both. I have a bit of a funny question here, funny and interesting. It comes from Tom. Was one of Sargent's cigars found during any of the restorations? And this is a very leading question for you both. Do tell.
A cigar was found, a cigar butt. We found it tucked, like when we were up on the scaffolding, it had fallen in behind the molding in the wall. And we romantically like to think, because Sargent was known for smoking cigars, but we don't know if it was his or it could have been someone from the 1953 restoration, because they were up there as well. I think I leave it to you to decide who might belong. We did not do any DNA testing, for example.
So when I first started here, I was promised about 10 years ago that you guys would do DNA testing for us. So
I didn't promise anything yet.
We don't have that answer yet. But it is a great question. I have a couple specific questions about the materials. One comes from Gretchen. You had mentioned electrotype material. What does that term mean? Can you elaborate on that a little bit further?
Do you want to take it, Gianfranco?
Casting technique, really.
Yeah, it's a casting technique, but basically as I understand it, it basically is it's a more sort of modern version of casting very thin layers of metal in the shape that you want them in. And I believe it was a kind of a tin alloy, I think is
that sounds right. Was it over some kind of a core? Was it like over?
Yeah, it's basically just it's in a bath, I'm sure. Again, I'm not my area of expertise, but it's in a bath, and basically the metal is just deposited onto that, and you get a very thin coating. But they are metal. I mean, it's quite it's substantial enough to they feel like a thin piece of like aluminum or tin foil kind of thing. But yeah, pretty amazing that he actually, I figured you could do this and had somebody cast these things that way. It's just like, yeah, talk about obsession.
Absolutely. And speaking of raised relief, we have a question from Jerry. Were the 3D elements, example, jewels, swords, created in London and then assembled in situ at the BPL?
Yeah, I think most everything was, I think, pretty well. I think when you start getting into the later installations, the one thing we didn't mention, neither Kate or I did, especially with the mural, the lunettes up on the east and west wall up in the upper reaches there. A lot of those materials, we didn't show them, but there are a lot of images that show them in situ where he's actually pinning them up to the murals. And you can see rope and pulley systems where he's taking the actual painting that's going to go up there ultimately and probably raising it to see how these applications would look. And the library has there's leftovers of this material all over the place, Harvard.
That he didn't use.
but again, he was, futzing with these things on site. Again, I think most of it was done in London, but when he got on site, he was still playing a lot with how these things would be used or not used.
We do have actually some raised relief elements, particularly samples of that Lincrustal Walton in BPL's collection. And there's actually, you had mentioned it, it came up in the lecture last night, but you had also mentioned it in one of your essays in this volume that there was a bit of pentimento applied, both layers of paint accumulating over each other that had been applied in later stages, certainly during that 1916 installation, in which Sargent was, spent the longest amount of time in Boston working on the murals for that particular phase, installation 3 of 4. But where we also see some paint applied over the Lincrustal Walton, and that, particularly on the figure we mentioned, added to Hell, you had noted had actually created oxidation or darkening of the paint because of the surface on which it was applied, or essentially this sort of anything that was applied to paper or metal darkened at different rates than it would if it were, say, applied to Belgian linen. Did you find that throughout your process that you were seeing, pigments actually darkening over time depending on what surface they were applied to?
That's really hard to answer. I don't know, Kate. It's hard to say.
I think depending, like the paper mache was a bit more absorbent, so you could sense it, whereas in the plaster too, I mean, to some degree, but it was hard to guess how it might have changed over time. But I think certainly the halo on the Christ figure had literally rusted. I mean, little changes like that. Yeah. But I think I do remember that figure on the Hell mural and the way it sank into the paper surface. Yeah, there were little things like that, but for the most part, I think it was intact.
The one thing I wanted to say is, to make clear, and I think I know Kate alluded to it, he painted the murals. All the compositions are painted. There aren't any areas where he ahead of time knew I'm going to put a relief on there. He actually paints basically everything is painted out on the canvas to one level or another, and then he's going in and applying these things strategically where he wants to highlight things. So it's really fascinating the way he was thinking about these things.
I'll take one more question, and then a couple of questions are about the recordings of these lectures, which I'll close with. But we have a number of wonderful questions here. I'm happy to share these with you guys after the lecture, and we will do our best on the BPL side to get these questions answered to all of you that have shared them. We're very appreciative of a very engaged audience this evening. One last question from Alex. Was it unusual at that time for murals to have three-dimensional or sculptural elements? Also, was this one of the more difficult conservations you've ever done?
Yeah, it was very unusual. I mean, Kate can weigh in too. Yeah, I mean, the great comparison is to go onto the second floor and look at the Puvis de Chavannes murals, which are paint on canvas mounted to the wall. And again, it was this kind of respect for the flat surface of the wall. You're not trying to create depth in the murals. You're actually respecting, even though you're doing figurative work, it's still very flat, frieze-like. And Sargent paints that way also. There's frieze-like, but he just takes it to another level. But I think, it's pretty clear that his trips to Europe and the Middle East, he's seeing a lot of these interior of churches and with, more Orthodox kind of churches, Greek churches, where there is a lot of like relief kind of work. So he's incorporating that, again, that ancient, I don't want to say ancient in a negative way, but, the earlier forms of decorating buildings and the
play of light.
The play of light is
with the way light was going to fall, and it really just animates it that much further to project out into space.
Yeah. In fact, and if you're ever in the library, I hope you are. You should go there often. If you go into the Abbey murals, the Quest for the Holy Grail, there's a story of actually Abbey. They were working together at one point where they were sharing a studio, and Abbey's, again, another character who'd never done murals before. These guys are unbelievable. And he's struggling with trying to create these gilded sort of surfaces directly on the canvas. And Sargent tells them, well, why don't you do them in relief? And they'll show up better. And he does them. And you'll see that a number of the murals there have really elaborate reliefs on the surface that are gilded. And again, as Kate was just saying, it's not just sculptural, but this interplay with light and how it reflects off the surface. And one thing I have to say, gold works best when you're in a darker condition. You overlight it, it just goes flat. pick up, and you get these beautiful effects of gold, that don't work the same way when you overlight it. So they were very, very aware of how these materials would look in the context of where they installed them.
Wonderful. Well, again, thank you both. We have a number of questions in the chat about whether or not these sessions will be recorded. We will be posting and actually sending out to all of you guys who had registered for last night's lecture, as well as this tonight's lecture. We'll be sending out links to recordings as soon as they're made available. So please share these broadly with your family, friends, colleagues. We want this to have a life after this live lecture series, so it can continue to be a resource, and certainly with credit due to incredible contributors like Gianfranco and Kate and everybody that's worked on these murals. We're honored to be in the company of such incredible people in this series. The next lecture coming up is next Monday evening with Molly Crawford-Volk. She will be lecturing in the same format on webinar at 6 p.m. on Monday, May 16th. So please join us if you can. And again, we'll be posting more information on those recordings and upcoming lectures when it becomes available. For now, let me just say again, with the utmost thanks, Gianfranco and Kate, thank you for being here tonight. Thanks to all of you watching tonight. We hope you enjoyed it. We hope you'll continue to engage with these murals, and we hope you'll continue to ask questions and come visit us and learn more. We're here for you, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you all.